all of these young, brave men and women who were tragically slain yesterday and their families. Mr. President, the purpose why I rise today is to talk about the spending of this Congress. It's something that I've been doing for the last few weeks since I had the privilege to join this institution as the senator from Florida. I have big concerns, Mr. President, and the more that I've been here and the more that I've seen over the past few weeks has given me even more concern. Unlike American families and unlike the majority of American states, this institution spends money it doesn't have. Each day, we go more than $4 billion in debt as we pay for programs that we don't have enough money for. $4 billion a day, the national debt grows. Additionally, Mr. President, we spend $253 billion a year on interest payments. It's the fourth largest expenditure in the budget after defense, Social Security, and Medicare. So the fourth largest expenditure that we spend every year doesn't go to a new program, it doesn't go to help a person, it goes to pay for programs in the past that we couldn't afford. It took us until 1982 to go $1 trillion in debt, yet we are shortly coming upon nearly $12 trillion in debt. Mr. President, in a matter of days, we will hit that number. More troubling still, this past year, 2009, this Congress, for its annual budget, grew a deficit of $1.4 trillion. That is as much deficit as was accrued in the past 4 years combined. So, Mr. President, I plan to come to this chamber every week and talk about the spending problem that this Congress has in order to highlight this issue. It is of grave concern to me, not just as a senator that represents 18 million people in Florida, but as a father of 3 children, Max, Taylor, and Chase, 6, 4, and 2, and a baby on the way. My wife and I are concerned, like every parent should be, about their future. And it's our obligation as parents to make sure that they have better opportunities than we had. In fact, that is the American creed, that every generation ensures that its children have equal or better opportunities than the opportunities that they enjoyed. But I'm concerned, Mr. President, for my children and for all the children in this country, that at this present rate of spending, we will not be able to ensure that they have those equal or better opportunities. Mr. President, Congress is spending too much. Both sides of the aisle talk about fiscal restraint and fiscal discipline, yet we keep spending more than we have. This government took in $2.1 trillion in revenues this year, yet we spent $3.5 trillion in expenditures. Now, I'm not used to this system, Mr. President, because, as you know, I come from a state system where I served as a chief of staff to a governor, and in Florida, we had to balance our budget. Every year, we looked at the receipts. We eagerly and anxiously looked, almost on a monthly basis, to see how much money was coming in, to determine how much money could be spent, or what kind of tax breaks could be given back to the people, or how much money could be put in reserves. Those were the good times. As the economy declined, we watched as the money came in and we made decisions about how much we were going to have to cut, because at the end of the day, we had to balance the budget. But Congress doesn't do that. Congress spends more than it takes in, and it puts those obligations on our children and our grandchildren who someday will have to pay off this debt. But the time, Mr. President, to make tough choices shouldn't be tomorrow. The time to make tough choices is today. One of the first pieces of legislation that I had an opportunity to consider and to vote on was an appropriations bill for housing, urban development, and transportation, important issues for this country. And in that opportunity to consider that appropriations bill, this Congress could have cut spending or increase the deficit. Well, it chose to increase the deficit, and the increase was by more than 23% over last year's budget. In a time where we are spending much more than we have, in a time when we're about to have a $12 trillion national debt, we decided to spend 23% more than we did last year. And what do we spend the money on? Well, certainly plenty of good things. Obviously, transportation and housing are important, but we spent money on a lot of questionable things too, Mr. President. We built transportation museums, monuments to roads we have not yet built. We put up congratulatory signs saying this is how we spent money on a road. We funded airports with no planes, as the number of Americans losing their job have now risen to 10.2%, the national unemployment level. Mr. President, we are spending $700 million a day to pay the interest on the debt, and we're funding transportation museums. If we would have just stayed at the spending level from last year and cut out these extraneous programs, congratulatory signs that tell us that we built a road, transportation museums, and other spending programs that amendments that were offered sought to cut but did not pass, we would have saved $12.7 billion. Now, in Washington, $12.7 billion doesn't sound like a lot of money. We talk about trillions of dollars here. But $12.7 billion could have done a lot of good. What could we have spent that money on? I think, Mr. President, it's important to realize that every time we spend a dollar, we're making a choice. It's a choice about how we're going to direct this country's future. And we could either return that dollar and not spend it, give it back to the people who paid it, or we could not spend it and not increase our debt and put that on our children's backs, or we could have spent it on something different and maybe better. And let me give you an example. One thing that I applaud the administration for in their stimulus program is they have $8 billion set aside for high-speed rail. That's exactly the kind of thing that this country should undertake. The federal government shouldn't do much, but what the federal government can do are things that communities and states can't often do for themselves. And high-speed rail is such a national-sized project, in my opinion, that the role of the federal government is there. And it makes sense in this difficult economic time because you actually will create thousands of jobs by building the high-speed rail. And then once you've built it, you will have a long-term gain because that high-speed rail will be there to promote infrastructure, to promote jobs, to ease the burdens on our everyday lives. So I applaud that program. And there's $8 billion in the federal budget this year that states can apply for to build high-speed rail. My state of Florida has an application in along with 40 other states. And we're seeking $2.5 billion to connect Orlando to Tampa, which would be fantastic for our state, and I hope that our state gets those dollars. But there's only $8 billion to apply for, and there's 40 states that want the money. Imagine if we would have taken the $12.7 billion that we wasted here and put it into that program. Maybe more states could have had high-speed rail. Let me give you another example. What can you do with $12.7 billion? Well, with $12 billion, you could put 427,000 college students through a 4-year college. We have to realize, Mr. President, that every time we spend a dollar, it's a choice. And that dollar could have been spent better, or it could have been returned to the people. And I want to add, too, Mr. President, that President Obama recommended in this budget, in this appropriation bill, that we cut $211 million out of it. I don't think that was enough. But give credit where credit is due. He suggested we cut $211 million. We didn't even do that. The Senate could only find $15 million to cut, and the House only $20 million. And because of Congress's spending and the administration's lack of willingness to cut spending, President Obama has presided over more new domestic spending in his first 10 months in office than President Clinton did in 8 years. One of the first bills that I supported when I came here, Mr. President, was the Budget Enforcement Legislative Tool Act of 2009. It's a long title, but it's a proposal that I would think both Republicans and Democrats should be able to agree upon. The bill requires us in Congress to do an up or down vote on the President's recommendation on spending. In this case, we would have cut more than $200 million if we would have adopted the President's recommendation. Not enough, but still better than what we did. So, Mr. President, I believe it's time to stop talking about cutting spending and doing something about it. I'm going to come here each week to the floor and talk about the various appropriations bills that we've gone over. I'm going to keep a running tally, starting with the $12 billion we could have saved in this appropriation. And at the end of the day, hopefully, the comments that I make will encourage others in this body and in the House of Representatives to take this spending situation seriously. You know, I guess all of us wish we were in the situation the federal government was in, where we could just spend more than we got in terms of income and then never have to pay it back. But the truth is the federal government's not in that situation either. One day, the chickens are going to come home to roost. One day, we're going to be accountable for this money that we spent. One day, it's going to impact our standing in the world. And I believe that day is very soon. We already know that the banks of the world, the central banks, are starting to shed dollars. They no longer want to hold our currency because they're losing faith in the United States of America as the leading world financial power. We already know that we are having to sell more and more debt to countries that don't even have our interest, countries like China. We already know that we're losing our standing and our ability to move forward because the rest of the world doesn't feel like we financially manage our situation well. While our economy is straining, while countries look at us as suspect for our spending patterns, countries like Brazil are on fire as American dollars and investments go there because people think there's better opportunities to make money in those countries than in the United States. Mr. President, I want a better future for our children. And if we're going to have a better future for our children, we're going to have to restrain our spending. We're going to have to get serious about balancing the budget of the federal government, just like the states do and just like families do across America. Mr. President, I yield my time.